Now, Child Protection Week has been unveiled by Social Development Minister Susan Shabangu. The Child Protection Week campaign was initiated in 1997 to raise awareness about the needs for communities to protect children from abuse and other forms of violence. This year's theme is Let Us Protect All Children to Move South Africa Forward. Now, earlier we spoke to Deputy Minister of Social Development, Henrietta Bohopane Zulu, on the department's plans for Child Protection Week.
Part of why we are forever out in doing community, we run dialogues literally every day. We're implementing positive parenting programs, but we're also implementing strengthening of families, because from where we are, we believe that strengthened families are able to withstand all the social ills. And right now, we are seeing, like Florence said, children are kidnapped, children are raped, it all starts in the family. If we can sort out the family and we make sure that the family functions, we will be able to reach a particular point where we are able to protect our children. The Department of Social Development remains the guardian of all children. That's where we start. But society takes the first responsibility. Today we're moving into nuclear families, we're moving into high-walled. The more we try to secure the children, the more we actually isolate them. Yeah. But also we acknowledge, that is why we've launched the ECBND program, where we're no longer putting children in orphanages, but rather we try and firstly protect their inheritance by keeping them in their original communities so that they are able to live there, but also protecting siblings, because our foster care system separates siblings. So at the moment, there is a lot that we are doing.
Now, joining us on the phone line is Shahida Omar, who's the clinical director at the Teddy Bear Clinic. Shahida, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us.
Good evening to you and the listeners out there.
Great. Let's get right into it. Now, we're seeing still too many incidents of abuse to children in the country. Can you just give us an overview of how prevalent abuse is in the country?
Well, if we just look at the statistics, and it's not statistics because we know statistics is underreported and under-frequently reported. So we can just look at the child homicides where, according to the Medical Research Council, reporting 2 child murders a day. According to the SAP statistics, we're looking at 3 children being murdered every day. And 74% of the child fatalities fall under the age of 5 years. And 15% of these children who are killed in the context of physical abuse and neglect. So I think these statistics should actually not only alarm one, but to realize that we've become a reactive society. We just tend to jump and start running in crisis mode to remedy the situation when we are faced with bodies being chopped off children, put in bags, children being raped and murdered, children being, falling down latrines. Then everybody starts really rushing in a frantic fashion. And then soon thereafter, there's the next one. And it seems like this is a society that has become desensitized to the plight of children. Yes, I agree with the MEC and with the Deputy MEC that positive parenting and that parents have a role to play, but parents are not the only ones that have a role to play here. Every sector of society, every government department, and every civil society partner needs to come to the party and needs to actually put action. We need to actually mobilize action, because the death of one child is the death of far too many children. We go back to the 2000s, mid-2000s. We're talking of just today the sentencing of the perpetrator of Courtney Peters. But there are many Courtney Peters, many baby Samanthas, baby Tsepangs, and that continues. And what I'm saying is there seems to be an increase in the incidence and prevalence. And are we still talking about Child Protection Week? Really? I think we need to go beyond Child Protection Week because we've been doing Child Protection Week for years. It seems to be a fruitless expenditure. It's wonderful because everybody starts jumping up and politicians start scoring brownies and putting their voices to the vote. But at the end of the day, what has actually happened? We found there's been an increased escalation of these horrendous, heinous crimes that are violated and inflicted on children who are the most vulnerable, powerless and helpless sector of society, the most marginalized population group. So we need to start reviewing and revising. What we're doing is clearly not working.
Now let's bring it closer to the home, Shahida. We mentioned there that a family needs to play a role. But now what you find in most cases, and I'll use the example of the 2-month-old who was raped, and it's still not clear who the perpetrator is. And we also seeing the physical abuse at the hands of the mother and the stepfather in this landmark sentencing to life of this couple who killed their 3-year-old child. So now what do we do in the space of a family to protect our children?
So we need to start working with our children from very young. We need to ensure that our children are equipped and enabled and empowered with information. We know that information is knowledge and knowledge is power. So if our children start learning from a young age, understanding what is acceptable behavior, what is unacceptable behavior, aware of their rights and responsibilities, aware of safe and unsafe touches. We need to start talking to our children when they're in kindergarten, already at the age of 2 and older. But we need to continue this throughout their schooling career or lifespan and take this beyond that. Children that are already in their teens and the possibility of bearing children, we need to actually be engaging in dialogue with them, talking about domestic violence, talking about gender-based violence, and ensuring that they have deeper insight and understanding so that if they are faced with that situation, that they would know what course of action to pursue, where to get help, and that the resources are available at hand. So these are conversations that we need to continue at every level, even in the corporate sector, in the workplace settings. The employee wellness program needs to reach out to all its employees. And I think not only is it the responsibility of civil society, but I think if we look at Department of Housing, Department of Manpower, Department of Labor, and it's not only government, like your law enforcement agencies, but it's also other people across the sector of society. So everybody needs to actually put their shoulders to the wheel. We need to come to the party to make sure that the same information awareness is being created at all levels, with children, with older children, with adolescents, with adults, with older people, but across society about acceptable and unacceptable. And law enforcement agencies need to ensure that actions have consequences. More rigorous procedures need to be followed when evidence is being captured and when a case is being investigated, because that's where we're falling short. We don't have sufficient resources to complete rape kits or the DNA kits. We don't have vehicles where SAP, the FCS unit, does not have vehicles. If you look at Gauteng province, who is under-resourced. So justice delayed is justice denied forever. Systems failing children, systems inducing secondary trauma, systems raping children. And this is why we're saying that it's not just the responsibility of the family, but it's the responsibility of every member and sector of society to assume responsibility here. And we need to get politicians to put money to their mouths. They need to allocate resources. They need to allocate budgets and ensure that, it's kinako, it's time now.
Now, let me just cut in there, Shahida Omar. You mentioned something about the secondary trauma that children go through when an issue of abuse has come to light. Now, there were specialized courts put into place in order to prevent such. Can you give us more insight into how far that's been happening and if it is helping in just curbing the secondary trauma that they go through?
So you are absolutely correct. There are specialized courts, the sexual offences courts. The most recent statistic in the last week that I was informed of is that as far as the current status is concerned, that there are 74 sexual offences courts out there. But I think in practice, in theory, they're all wonderful. But in practice, not every court is resourced with the same services where there's a separate room for the victim or a special room, or if the CCTV surveillance cameras are working. So again, in theory and ideally, that's what should be happening. But we're finding that that's not always being implemented. But I think also in terms of not just the sexual offences courts, we need to look at the personnel. When they interview children or cross-examine children, the communicating methods when they're talking to children often is inducing further trauma to the victims. The victims feel, ashamed, humiliated, intimidated. And we've had victims who say, but I was asked a question so many times that I eventually changed my story because I thought they're not believing me. Or even with your FCS units, when a crime is reported to the police, the way they respond, interrogating and the accusatory line of questioning often deters the victim from pursuing the criminal matter. As a result, they would recant and withdraw the case. So I think these are challenges that we continue to face. It's not something new, but it's something that is common and continues. And of course, as a result, induces secondary trauma. And we've had many victims coming forward and saying that they'd rather put the matter to bed and not pursue the matter with the criminal justice system or with the law enforcement agencies, because it's the very systems that are supposed to protect them that have failed them.
Hida Omar, thank you so much. That was our clinical director at the Tavy Bay Clinic talking to us abuse as we look forward to launching Child Protection Week. But also joining us now in studio is Anele Siswana, who's a clinical psychologist, talking about the same thing. A warm welcome to you, Anele.
Great. Good evening.
Great. Now, abuse in children. How do we spot it? You remember there was an incident at a school in Soweto where 80 children were abused by the same man and nobody spotted it. How do we look out for the signs?
The teller signs are quite difficult to understand, particularly if a child does not come forth, is not forthcoming with them. But what you'd often see is that you'll realize the child would present or behave in ways that are not normal. And probably in the school context, what you realize that their school performance declines, their emotional ability begins to deteriorate than normal. So some children will become much more withdrawn. Some children will become much more difficult to engage. And so some may cry more, some may cry less, some may find it hard to express their emotions. So the teller signs could be academic, the teller signs could be psychological, the teller signs could be social, in a sense that they may be withdrawn to participate and play like any other kid. So there will be a number of multiple factors that you would see, as I've explained, the psychological, that their well-being and way of relating with other children is different. At the same time, you realize that their academic performance is no longer as up to par than usual in a school context. But at home, you also realize that if the perpetrator is at home, they will be hard to relate like they are used to, especially if the perpetrator is an uncle or around. So they may not be forthcoming to be as expressive as they would be if it was someone outside. So the context plays a lot of role in the way that the child expresses and where we will be able to pick up those signs that are quite problematic and noisy for one to be able to pick up the child may be abused.
Okay, and now as a parent, you pick up on the signs.
Yeah.
And you want to know what's wrong with my child. Obviously, you can't pinpoint it, but you have your suspicions. How do you then go forward to getting the child to be assessed and help? Where do you go? What is your next step? From seeing that there's something's wrong with my child, what is the very next step?
My recommendation is always start with the justice system, which is if you really see that in a case where, for instance, there's a rape case or a sexual abuse or any sexual form, the first step would be to report it to the police station. And at the police station, then they would help you to find other possible ways of dealing with that. Secondly, to take the child to hospital for them to be evaluated. But at the same time, we can consider exploring the role or use of facilities like the social development. At the same time, make use of places like child welfare, where they've got these systems in place that they would help parents or any guardian or any person who's involved in the life of their child and guide them through that process. So Childline, Child Welfare, and many other organizations in Teddy Bear, they've got set structures that are put in place for parents and everybody who works with children to go through. At the same time, there are psychologists, social workers, and people that are psychologically and socially well trained in ways of negotiating possibilities of helping children to be well assessed properly. But there are clear set guidelines set in the Child Care Act. We tend to forget that children are protected in the Child Care Act, and there are many ways and possibilities through the Child Care Act we can navigate our ways in supporting and creating awareness that children are protected and well taken care of.
Now, before it even gets to that point, yes, we as caregivers need to protect our children, but you do understand that, especially with us black families, there's a lot of us. There's a lot of us.
Yes.
There's an uncle, there's an aunt. It's a very crowded environment most of the time. How do you then protect your child in that kind of environment?
I see it as a useful context, even though it has its disadvantages, because I'm of the view that it takes a nation to raise a child. And only if that context is conducive in the sense that the child does not feel intimidated and that the child is not imposed or overwhelmed by this kind of crowdedness. So I will believe that within that kind of crowdedness or that context, there will be a prominent or a primary caregiver that will take care of the needs of that child and make sure that the child is well taken care of, the child's voice is listened to. Because most of the time we believe that they are little nunus and they are little kids who don't have
They
to...
should be seen and
yeah,
not
they
heard.
should not be. But if there is one who is a primary caregiver or someone who's allocated to make sure that in that space of crowdedness, their needs are well taken care of, I do not mind. Because I believe in a system or in a context of a family system, all factors play a role in shaping and molding the character of a child. But if that is done within a context that is helpful and conducive to help the child, it yields to good results when there's that person who's allocated, who will provide nurturance, not only financially, not only the material needs, but also make sure that they take care of the emotional needs of a child, because that is very much important. And that is when we're able to spot on some of these telltale signs, because when you are in tune with your child, when you are in tune with their understanding, you're able to tell, no, my child today is different. You're able to identify their behavioral patterns and changes that take place in the process.
Yeah. And one last question before we wrap up. Can you just give us an indication of what a child goes through? A child is abused and it goes undetected for years. What kind of effect does that have on the child?
There's a lot of effects eventually in the end, particularly around personality formation, because I'm of the view, and we believe that as psychologists, what you see in a person's personality, in a person's character, in the whole totality of a person is as a result of a number of series of factors, which we call it psychosocial factors that contribute to the formation of one's personality character. So it could be that if a child is abused, there could be issues of mistrust in the end. There could be issues of difficulties in relating with other people and establishing relationships. There could be potential of serious personality disorders developing, like borderline personality disorder, where one struggles to maintain and establish relationships. At the same time, that child could have difficulties in understanding themselves and in moving forward. So it's not only psychological, but their way of being and relating and trusting the world could be distorted. So there's a number of factors that would then contribute in the personality of a child being disturbed, at the same time difficulties in managing themselves, at the same time undealt traumas have the potential to really not make a good deal in the end, because all of these undealt psychological factors lead to unprocessed anger, lead to unprocessed trauma, which may be misinterpreted, at the same time misdirected to the wrong people at times. So it's really helpful that immediately we spot something, we help a child to go through psychotherapy, we help the child to find possible ways where they can be taken to play therapy, where they can play out those emotions, where they can play out those undealt traumatic experiences, so that we limit the potential and curb some of the difficulties that they may have in terms of their personality and in their growth later in life.
Anele, thank you so much.
Great.
Thank you so much for your insight into this issue. That was clinical psychologist Anele Siswana talking to us about child abuse and how to protect children as the country launches Child Protection Week.